means the kingdom. So he says, I'm praying in behalf of the kingdom with an eye toward bringing it into existence, an eye toward ushering it in. He's trying to help the process along here. Okay? While I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, who I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering, and he gave me instruction and talked with me and said, and this is how I imagine it went, "Oh, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight with understanding." And from there, he gets a correction. Verse 23, he goes on, "At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision." I love that line because it says, at the beginning, I was dispatched. So up in heaven, as soon as he starts praying this prayer, God in heaven's like, oh, he's way off. Gabriel, get down there. We got to stop this guy. He's way ahead of script. Because that's what he's doing. I mean, he's gone off thinking he's over here, and God's saying, oh my gosh, come on, go down there. Let's deal with this. And he sends Gabriel down, and he says to him, I'm going to give you insight with understanding. Another great phrase. Everyone thinks they have insight, but not everyone's got understanding. And so insight is, I guess, the Bible's way of saying you have an opinion. But I need you to have one with understanding, he says. That's the key. And then he begins to give them the correction. All right, so that's our focus as we finish here. What is the correction? And here's the correction he's told. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. All right, so Gabriel tells Daniel that 70 weeks have been appointed for Daniel's people, not merely 70 years. All right, but that can't be right because 70 weeks is a lot less, not the extra time we're looking for, right? So we have to understand what he's saying here. Weeks, first of all. All right, so weeks in our Bible is actually a very poor English translation. Some of you may have a better one in your Bible. It may say sevens in your Bible. And if it does, you have a better Bible than I do because the word in Hebrew is Shabbat. Shabbat is the word for seven. It should be translated 77s. So what Daniel heard is 77s are appointed. 490 are appointed. Now the question is 77s, 490 of what? Well, it's not hard to understand what that 490 is because we know it just cannot be some of these options because it would just make the problem worse, right? And furthermore, we already know how the counting has been done. We know, for example, that we have the land Sabbath 70 years. And we know we're going to have years and years of time for the coming kingdoms, right? So there's really only one conclusion here. We're looking at years. That's the longest period we could be looking at that makes any sense. So Gabriel says you're going to have 490 years for the age of the Gentiles from that point forward, not 400, not one more year or whatever Daniel thought it was. But even that poses an issue, right? Because 490 years is long since past. We're well beyond that. And yet we haven't seen Jesus come back yet. So it seems to be there's this conundrum. We know we're still in the age of the Gentiles because we haven't seen what was said to happen at the end yet. We haven't seen 10 world leaders, right? We haven't seen one guy rule the world. But on the other hand, that number doesn't fit with the time that it's been. And given how specific and how precise all of the prophecy's been up to this point, we can't expect that it's going to be that off. So let's see if we can find how this works. And to do this, you need to follow carefully with what I'm doing on the slides. All right, so Daniel begins to get a specific roadmap on how to count, because the counting of the 490 is a bit unorthodox. It starts off simple enough. We hear in verse 25, "You are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress." Now what I'm going to do is we're going to stop from just reading it. We're going to break it apart, because as you break it apart, you begin to see how the language is meant to be understood. There are mile markers here being given for how we chart the 490. Starting with, he says, there will be, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, 7 weeks. Now we know these weeks are sevens of years, so we're saying 7 sevens of years. So a decree will be issued. We know Cyrus did that. We already said this. So in a very short time following this vision, Cyrus did exactly what Daniel was told to look for. A decree was issued, and then it says 7 weeks until the restoration of the temple. And then to confirm that, he puts another mile marker at the end. He says, the walls will be finished even in times of distress. So the finishing of the walls marks the end. And sure enough, if you look at history and Scripture, Nehemiah's finishing the walls 39 years after the decree of Cyrus. Okay? And then we get to the next mile marker. He says, and these are interwoven, but he says, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 62 weeks, picking up from where the previous one ended. They're meant to be connected to each other. The language makes that clear. You see in the language, until, and, it will be, and so on. So there is this connection of events. You have the next mile marker being when Messiah will be cut off, which we know refers to Jesus' crucifixion. So you have these two periods, 62 weeks, 49 years, which is 7 sevens, followed by 62 sevens, which is another 434 years. You put the two together, and of course you got 483 years and 69 of our 77s already by the time Jesus is crucified. I got 1 7 left over. So where's that final 7? All right, well, we got one more verse, and let's see if I'm looking at my text here, right? Verse 27, he says, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. On the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. All right, so now we have this next line. He says, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. All right, so there's our next mile marker. The problem, though, is that this mile marker is not connected to anything in the prior block. There's nothing in the language that says, start counting this when Messiah is cut off. It just jumps out from nowhere. The final 7 begins, it says, with a covenant. Well, not the covenant of Jesus. This is a covenant that's different. It's one made with many. And there is no connecting word in the language. So that means that the final 7 happens at some unknown moment, and as a result, it implies a break or a pause in the counting. And that makes sense because we know there have been a lot more years than 490. And yet we know we haven't reached the end. So the only way mathematically that you can still be counting and yet only have 7 left is that the count has some unspoken period in the middle that's not included in the 490. And that's where we are right now. And that period will break when a signing of a covenant happens between the one and the many. Who is the one? Who is the many? Well, let's start with the many. The many has to be Israel because the effect of the covenant is that it opens up the opportunity for grain, offerings, and sacrifice. There's only one community of people on earth who would still want to do that, and that is the Jewish people. And so, and given that this is a Jewish prophet writing to a Jewish people, it makes sense. He's talking about what happens to Israel. They get a covenant to do what they want to do, so most of them. Who's the one that allows them to do it? Well, if you look at the one, it's not specified, but it has to be someone Daniel already knows, otherwise it would have been. And since this is happening at the end of the age, remember, we're talking about the last 7. We're talking about the end of the 490 at that point. We're talking about right before Jesus comes back. Is there a one that's in charge back in that time? Well, we just heard there would be, the 11th horn. Right? So it doesn't take a leap of logic to say that if I'm at the end and there's a one, and Daniel's supposed to know who this one is, it's probably the one that's already been revealed to him. So we conclude it's the 11th horn. And so this scene must include, and of course 3.5 years would be halfway through the 7. So we start to see the timelines making sense there as well. All right, so we have a covenant struck with Israel somewhere in that last 7, so at the beginning of the last 7, which allows Israel to begin doing what it wants. But then we also hear that midway through the 7, you notice this, in the middle of the week, there will be a stop in the sacrifice. Seems awful coincidental that at the middle of the week, that's also the 3.5 year point. That's also times and half a time. That's also the moment that this 11th horn gains power. You start to see a moment there that apparently has a lot of significance. Okay? Where's the church? Well, in this drawing, where's the church? Right, I mean, you start to think, well, gee, that pause has some purpose, right? Paul actually tells us, and put the complete destruction, by the way, is the final mile marker, because that's how the age ends. That pause now has to have some purpose, and Paul gives us the purpose. We take the church, and we say the church now fits somewhere in there, and Paul says, what then? What Israel is seeking, it is not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Israel, by God's decree, was set aside for a time, apart from a remnant, and in its place, he says this, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Well, may it never be. By their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous, to make Israel jealous. And he ends by saying, I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening, that's this hardening he just talked about, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Or we could rephrase that, until the completeness of the age of the Gentiles. Or until the completeness of the period of Gentiles, specifically talking about the church. So what he just said is this whole plan above is about Israel. It's about bringing Israel to a conclusion that God has ordained for his people. But there's a pause inserted into that period of work, specifically for the church to occupy, a period in which Gentiles will get preference instead of Jews for the sake of the gospel. And it is going to continue until the fullness, or that word is the complete number, of Gentiles is found by God as he appoints. Once that period has met its purpose and is complete, then the age has moved back to the point of Israel's focus, and that is that last 7 for Israel. So let's put these pictures together. So we have, you'll find something interesting here that you may not have seen before, but you see it now from the text clearly. How long is the age of the Gentiles? It's not 490 years. It's much longer because of the pause. But even the counting in Daniel is not just 490. It's how many? It's the 70 plus 490. They had 70 years they had to sit in the land for the land Sabbaths, outside the land, for the land Sabbaths. Then that's when Daniel thought they were done, but that's when the angel came and said, no, you got 490 more. So they effectively had 10 sevens for the period that the land needed to rest, and that was for a specific purpose. That was for the purpose of letting the land rest. The purpose of the next 490 years, or 70 sevens, is a different purpose. It's a different purpose because the land Sabbath was already met. That's why Israel comes back after the 70 years, but it doesn't end the age of the Gentiles. Because one purpose is met while another one is ongoing. And now we're learning that the church age actually fills that space up until the point at which the attention of God shifts back from the Gentiles to Israel and to that last 7 that he's appointed for Israel. And the decree that was issued to let Israel return and rebuild the city and begin this countdown was issued just as we said, just as we expected. Remember what Daniel was told, though, when he was told that decree would start a 70-year period. He was told that it would start, that's just to finish the thought we had before, the fullness of the Gentiles is the period we're in now. Oh, by the way, look at the bottom. Here's an interesting little notion. You have 10 at the bottom. We'll come back to that. And then you hear from Daniel 24, remember, that there were 70 weeks. Do you notice what they're appointed for? They're for your people. They're for your holy city. That's the age of the Gentiles. And then there are 6 reasons given below. And those 6 reasons are uniquely for Israel and for the entry of Israel into their kingdom. So the original 70 years was to let the land rest. The next 490 plus has been for Israel to experience these 6 outcomes, which you see listed from to make end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and so on. That's the accomplishment of the age of the Gentiles for the next 490. The 2 combined are accomplishing what God has intended. So here's back to that chart again. So you have 10 plus 70. Now what's really interesting about that is you have 10 plus 70 equal 80. I know you didn't think that was interesting, but trust me, that's very interesting. Because 10 is the number in the Bible for testimony. So you have a testimony being given concerning the land Sabbath. God said you're going to be outside the land. Here's your testimony to the world that I'm going to give my land its rests. They were out by 10. 70 is the number of completion. 70 will put a completion to the end of the age of the Gentiles. And the two combined is 80. 8 is the number of new beginnings. This will set up the next thing, the kingdom. 80 will lead to a new beginning in the kingdom for Israel. So this is the period of history that we're currently a part of. Here's the summary. This is what you learned in Daniel overall. The age of the Gentiles is a period of time judging Israel for their disobedience under the Old Covenant. The age began with Babylon, continues until Christ. The age concludes with a single world leader coming at the end to persecute the saints. He's ultimately destroyed by Christ's return. It lasts the 490 from the time of Cyrus, but there's that long pause that means we really don't know how long it's going to last. It's still ongoing. Until God in heaven decides it's time for the covenant to be struck and the clock starts, until then we don't know how long this goes. But in the moment that covenant is struck, you can count down 7 years exactly to the second coming of Christ. Okay. And then finally, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, then the final 7 may begin. There's a lot more we're going to say on that when we get to next week. So don't think that's the only thing you're going to hear that satisfies the timing of why the church is or isn't involved. There's a lot more coming on that. But in the meantime, just understand that the timing of Daniel makes clear that the age that we're in has this break for a reason and a restarting of the last 7 for a reason. And we're not the reason that it's restarting. We're the reason it paused. Final picture. So you have, in that graph I showed you earlier, the things that come after. Next week, we start looking at that. But we start by looking one more time at the break between the church age and what follows, so that we can understand what changes so that the last 7 can begin.